Let me distinguish between three types of neoliberalism. Three directions of reform in response to the perceived failures of social democracy in the 1970s that then set the pattern for the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, to some degree the 2010s, and even today. First, there is outside neoliberalism. That social democracy is fine for us, but that you cannot handle it. Your politics are too corrupt, too riddled with rent-seeking, and even where your bureaucrats are motivated and allowed by their political masters to do the good, they are too incompetent to succeed. Hence, neoliberalism as a counsel of despair applied to other people. For you, it is truly the case that government governs best, that governs least. Therefore, we will take every step we can to push you to shrink or outsource your government, and to expose your economy and polity to the discipline of the global market. You must produce, you must export, you must do so without the government getting in the way or doing much of anything. And under the harrow of that discipline, maybe in a couple of generations, growth will have been fast enough and the increase in social capability will be large enough that you'll be able to make another try at social democracy. This, in a nutshell, is a great deal of what the Washington Consensus applied to issues of economic development from the mid-1970s to, well, today was. It is still a live doctrine, it is still an active policy, and I would say it is not completely and totally false. Second, there is hard neoliberalism. The view that social democracy was basically misguided, that people need to be confronted with hard incentives or they will misbehave, and that misbehavior needs to be punished by poverty, degradation, and scorn. These hard incentives take the form of strict penalties for attempting to undermine inherited status and wealth hierarchies. These hard incentives take the form of making the rich richer to incentivize them to work harder and become job creators. And these hard incentives take the form of making the poor poorer to incentivize them to work harder and to not be moochers. Then third, well, there is soft neoliberalism. Soft neoliberalism is me, or at least me in my younger days. Soft neoliberalism holds itself out as social democracy by other and better means. Government provision and central direction are often overly bureaucratic and highly inefficient. Would it not be better to crowdsource solutions to social problems? To use taxes on activities with negative and bounties on activities with positive externalities? To rely on the market to incentivize the entire population rather than a few planners to come up with solutions to social problems that are truly grassroots and popular? Wouldn't this be better? Think globally in imposing Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. Act locally by using market incentives and market processes to push decisions about how global problems will be solved down to the action level of society where the information is. Soft neoliberalism is thus a kinder, gentler, better, spiffier, more effective means to social democratic ends. Indeed, John Maynard Keynes was perhaps the first soft neoliberal. We see this in chapter 24 of his General Theory. Central government direction, planning, and management of the market was necessary to achieve a good society. You need, quote, the enlargement of the functions of the government involved in the task of adjusting to one another the propensity to consume and the inducement to invest, unquote. Plus, on the microeconomic level, you need AC Pigou, controlling externalities. Quote, the modern classical theory has itself caused attention to various conditions in which the free play of economic forces may need to be guided, unquote. But, Keynes said, if the state is able to determine the aggregate amount of resources devoted to augmenting the instruments and the basic rate of reward to those who own them, it will have accomplished all that is necessary, unquote. And then Keynes flied his soft neoliberal freak flag proudly. The traditional advantages of individualism will still hold good. Advantages of efficiency, decentralization, and of the play of self-interest and of individual responsibility. They are even greater, perhaps, than the 19th century supposed. But above all, individualism is the best safeguard of personal liberty, widens the field for the exercise of personal choice, is the best safeguard of the variety of life, preserves the traditions which embody the most secure and successful choices of former generations. It colors the present with the diversification of its fancy, and being the handmaid of experiment as well as of tradition and of fancy, it is the most powerful instrument to better the future. As the global north, especially the North Atlantic, especially Britain and the United States, made the neoliberal turn at the start of the 1980s, with the encouragement of, and under the whip of the World Bank and the IMF, the emerging market economies of the global south found themselves making and forced to make the neoliberal turn as well. In the global south, among emerging markets, developing economies, underdeveloped economies, the half generation before 1980 had come as a substantial shock. Some had thought the poor countries of the world had been kept down by colonialism. With the end of colonialism, rapid growth was supposed to begin. Others had thought the poor countries of the world had been kept down by an absence of development aid, especially in technology transfer and assistance with managing the demographic transition. And yet, with the rise of the development aid community and the commitment of funds to global development via the World Bank, rapid growth should have begun. Yet, before 1980, and indeed after, it turned out that rapid growth was a great exception in the global south. The globe continued to become more unequal, and many poor countries became stunningly undemocratic, kleptocratic, and bureaucratically incompetent and inept. Something had gone wrong, and the neoliberal solution was proposed that while the global north might or might not manage fine with social democracy, the global south needed the cold douche, as Schumpeter would have called it, of neoliberalism. This was, the Washington Consensus view. The view that for poor countries the task was growth now, and outside of East Asia, not state-led growth. Redistribution to make growth equitable, social democracy, was a task for a generation from now, or for at least a generation from now. Technological upgrading via industrial policy, a la East Asia, or earlier Wilhelmine Germany, or earlier the Hamiltonian United States, was something that was far beyond the bureaucratic capacity of the emerging market countries of the global south. This Washington Consensus view, strong elements of which I must say were applied to the global north as well, was complex. There were supposed to be 7 pillars of wisdom for D.E. Lawrence, but here I see 12 pillars. 1. Emerging market economies should not choose their own policies. They should be dictated to by the world market, and developed economies should adopt these policies too. 2. Fiscal policy discipline. No Keynesian stimulus for big budget deficits were bad because they almost always and everywhere starved private investment and so capital formation. Monetary policy could substitute whenever it was desirable, when it was desirable to stimulate the economy. 3. A redirection of public spending from subsidies, especially indiscriminate subsidies of firms, toward broad-based provision of pro-growth and pro-poor services, like primary education, primary health care, and infrastructure investment. 4. On taxes, broaden the base and lower the rates. 5. No financial pressure, no detailed government managing of financial markets. Let interest rates find their relative market levels, rather than the government forcing some to lend and keeping others from borrowing. 6. No exchange rate manipulation. Let exchange rates find their free market levels as well. 7. Trade liberalization, with particular emphasis on elimination of required licenses for imports. 8. Liberalization of foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. Multinationals should be allowed to run as much of your economy as they want to. 9. Privatization, even of monopolies. That is, a government-run industry is almost surely worse than a private monopoly that has to take the long view and as an incentive to produce higher profits, and those profits are real income and productivity to somebody. 10. Deregulation. Abolition of impedance to market entry or excess licensing requirement. 11. Greater respect for property rights. Fewer your property rights depend on your having the government on your side. And 12. Inflation independent inflation control-focused central banks. And indeed, to assist in what was to be called the great moderation of the global business cycle. And independent inflation-focused central banks were indeed viewed as a great success up until 2010, not just in the global south, but in the global north as well. In the global north, we had hard neoliberalism. I swing back and forth between thinking this is another butterfly wing flap historical crux in the history of the long 20th century that could easily have gone otherwise, and thinking that there was going to be a neoliberal reaction, a shift back toward the market giveth, the market taketh away, blessed be the name of the market. Reagan and Thatcher were elected and re-elected. There was luck. Yet they and their advisors pushed on intellectual and policy fault lines. The fault lines were there. And so they changed not just policies for their terms of office, but how people thought about policies long afterwards. In some ways, this was dependent on the path of Reagan and Thatcher. In other ways, it was not Reagan, but it was Bill Clinton, who said that the era of big government is over. It was not Ronald Reagan, it was Barack Obama, who said that when individuals have to tighten their belts and economize because the country is in a recession, the government has to tighten its belt and economize as well. Shades of Herbert Hoover, rather than of John Maynard Keynes, or indeed common sense. When the private sector sits down and stops spending, then when it's the time for the government to stand up. That it is the boom, not the bust, that is the time for austerity in public spending. And so lower taxes for the rich, offering slight regard to benefits for the poor, truly became the conventional wisdom. That income inequality under social democracy had been, in a strong sense, too low, and that respect for elders, traditions, authority figures, and most of all the market and its logic had been unduly eroded. It was never clear whether this was more an incentives argument or more a moral worth argument. It was both. Would society produce greater good for a greater number if single mothers' status as people who had had bad luck and were doing a very valuable job for society, if that were eroded, if they were regarded instead as moochers popping out babies, so that they did not have to, quote, work, unquote? Was it genuinely thought that this would be a wealthier society? Or was it generally thought that this would simply be a less unjust society because the unequal moochers were being properly punished and treated unequally? The neoliberal turn changed the gradient along which even technocrats evaluated policies. All government regulation was presumed guilty, and this was not a very rebuttable presumption. There was maximum friendliness toward financial deregulation. Deregulated financiers made lots of money, and that had to be good. And the spheres of government regulation that were bad, somehow they included antitrust policy. That hard-right neoliberalism saw the abandonment of the competitive market as an ideal. For a monopoly position meant that you had done something right and productive in order to obtain it. Superior innovation or superior science or superior business judgment, and your monopoly profits were a suitable reward on both the moral and the efficient economy incentive levels for your previous good acts. We can see this frame of mind of this hard-right neoliberalism at work as late as the summer of 2012, in a speech that 2012 Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney gave to a dinner of donors in Florida. It leaked out because the plutocrats attending and Romney himself did not think that the caterers at the event had both agency and smartphones. In his talk, Romney focused on the 47%. 47% of Americans who, he thought and saw, were in many senses profoundly un-American. And because they were so large a minority, were on the point of becoming a majority that would seize permanent political power and so destroy what Romney saw as the positive exceptionalism of America. Romney said that 47% of the electorate were the Democratic base, that he was not going to win them. He had to win all of the other 53%. Romney said that 47% of Americans pay no income taxes. And Romney said that 47% of Americans, he'll never persuade them to take responsibility for themselves and their lives because they expect gifts from the government. Now, it is true that the Democratic base is around 47%, but those are not the same 47% as the 47% who pay no income taxes. Those 47%, well, they're predominantly elderly, right, who don't have income, who are retired, and the elderly are predominantly Republicans. They're predominantly Romney's base rather than Barack Obama's. And Americans who will never take responsibility for themselves or their lives and expect to be handed gifts by the government. I don't think that's 47% in anything other than Romney's fevered imagination. And it's neither, elderly Social Security elderly Social Security recipients, the second 40%, nor is it the high income, highly educated, high economic productivity tranche of the Democratic base that I see around me in Silicon Valley all the time. The speech was tuned high and shrill, I think because Romney wanted and needed the guests to open their wallets. So you can wonder how it is his considered judgment, but it is at some level both what he thinks and what he thinks his donors and his base think and want to hear. The interesting thing is how much of Romney's thought is hung on this 47% number that groups of his advisors apparently told him at some point, and that he got to be one single monolithic thing in his mind. Romney was supposed to pitch that 47% is the Democratic Party base in the presidential electorate, and again, he needs all 50% plus 1 of the remaining 3 percentage points, and to do that, he needs the dollars of the donors class. That was supposed to be his pitch. He was not supposed to jump to the 47% is the share of the population who pay no income tax, and are moochers, who were taught every year that government programs are a free lunch. They vote for them, good things happen, and other people pay the cost for them. He was not supposed to talk about that. But once Romney starts talking about 47% as the share of the Democratic base, his mind then jumps the track, because he's also been told that 47% is the share of the population that pays no income tax, and his advisors have allowed him to infer that they're people who receive from government and never contribute to it, rather than elderly who paid their taxes earlier. And he also somehow believes 47% is the share of Americans who have been taught they are oppressed victims, minorities, feminists, so forth, that rather than taking personal responsibility for their lives, they can sit back and let the government give them gifts. And they are irredeemable. They are the closest thing to damned you can be in secular politics. And it's interesting listening to Romney that all of these are exactly the same people, right? Go figure. They are not a monstrous unified regiment of feminists and minority members who believe they are victimized and do not contribute to the government and pay no income taxes and make up the Democratic base. That is so only in the head of Mitt Romney and the other hard-right neoliberals that's how he sees them, a single monstrous unified regiment and a lost, irredeemable cause who must be fought and who must be fought with every political weapon at his disposal. And one of those political weapons is then making sure that they are not prosperous, they are not happy, that the market punishes them for their good deeds. It's not just the market is creative, it's the destruction part. It's not just the market, it is that the market giveth, it is that the market taketh away. And so, blessed be the name of the market. And in fact, well, this is probably unfair, but let me dunk on Mitt Romney's wife, Ann Romney, as well. She would have made a truly excellent first lady, but there is a very strong sense that she exhibits, that many hard-right neoliberals exhibit, that they are not lucky people, but instead that they were themselves disadvantaged. They had to struggle hard for success, that other people should have to struggle too, and if they could make it, other people should have made it too. We can listen to her talking about life back as a graduate student, back when her life was not easy and she was disadvantaged. And indeed, they were not easy years. A $62 a month basement apartment. I didn't have the money to carpet the floor. But you can get remnant samples, so I glued them together, all different colors. It looked awful, but it was carpeting. Mitt had enough of an investment from stock that we could sell off a little at a time. Mitt and I walked to class together, shared housekeeping, had a lot of pasta and tuna fish, and learned hard lessons. The hard lesson that you might have to sell some of your stock if you go to graduate school, that some of the stock you've inherited from American Motors CEO, your father, George Romney. Is that the hard lesson? Former Democratic Texas Governor Ann Richards hit the nail on the head in assessing this kind of rhetoric when she spoke of then-future President George W. Bush as born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. The implication is that struggle and adversity build character. So where social democracy went wrong was when it tried to steal from the poor and the working class their very precious opportunity to confront adversity and to struggle, which Mitt and Ann Romney think that they shared in. Now, it should be obvious that I do not think that this makes much sense. And yet, I am still willing, at least sometimes, to call myself a card-carrying neoliberal.